Okay, the second response which the theist can give to the challenge of the problem of evil is the following. It is a mistake to think that the goods for which God permits these horrendous evils are totally beyond our ken. Okay, recall ken means understanding, so there's a mistake to think that the goods for which God permits these horrendous evils are totally beyond our understanding. For religious thinkers have developed very plausible theodicies that suggest a variety of goods that may well constitute God's reasons for permitting many of the horrendous evils that affect human and animal existence. Okay, so theodicies, let's see here, in the reading guide. Okay, as Rowe says at the beginning of this section, there are different theodicies, and he is just going to focus on one. A theodicy, in general, is a defense of God when objections or doubts about his existence or goodness or omnipotence are made based on the amount of evil and suffering in the world. Okay, so a theodicy is just that, a defense that God does exist. There are different versions of them, or different theodicies, but Rowe is just going to focus on one. We'll get to that in a second, though. For religious thinkers have developed very plausible theodicies that suggest a variety of goods that may well constitute God's reason for permitting many of the horrendous evils that affect human and animal existence. When we seriously consider these theodicies, we can see that we have good reason to think that premise 1 is false, for these theodicies provide us with plausible accounts of what may be God's justifying reasons for permitting the evils that occur in our world. Okay, the theist's first response was to argue that we have given no reason at all for thinking that premise 1 is true. In the second response, this response that we're looking at in this section, the theist proposes to give a good reason for thinking that premise 1 is false. Okay, so recall, everyone agrees that premise 2 is true. The question is whether or not premise 1 is true. There do exist evils in our world that God would have or has no good reason to permit. Okay, so based on the response in section 2.2, the theist is saying that this premise is false. There do exist evils in our world, and God has a good reason for permitting all of them. Okay, in the second response, the theist proposes to give a good reason for thinking that premise 1 is false. Okay, actually, let's look at that right now. So, the cornerstone of this theodicy is that human free will is a good of such enormous value that God is justified in creating humans with free will, even if, as Augustine held, God knew in advance of creating humans, that certain human beings would use their freedom to do ill rather than good. Okay, so the idea is free will is such a good thing that God lets humans act freely, even when that means that sometimes they'll do evil actions. And that's how we get both God's existence and the amount of evil that we have in the world. Okay, and of course, to the extent that theodicies do provide a good reason for rejecting premise 1, to that extent the theist will have pointed the way to reconciling the existence of God with the fact that our world contains the horrendous evils that it does. But do these theodicies really succeed in providing a good reason for rejecting premise 1? I believe they do not. But to demonstrate this, we would have to show that these theodicies taken together are really unsuccessful in providing what could be God's reason for permitting the horrendous evils in our world. Although I believe this can be done, I propose here to take just one of these theodicies, the one most commonly appealed to, and show how it fails to provide a good reason for rejecting premise 1. I refer to the free will theodicy, a theodicy that has played a central role in defense of theism in the theistic religions of the West. Okay, so this theodicy was developed extensively by St. Augustine, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries. The free will theodicy proposes to explain all the evils in the world as due either directly to evil acts of human free will or to divine punishment for evil acts of human free will. The basic idea is that rather than create humans so that they behave like automatons, I don't know if we talked about automatons in the chapter on the mind, but basically an automaton in this context would just be like behaving as a robot. As we saw in that chapter on the mind, maybe robots can have minds, but we'll leave that aside. Here the idea is being an automaton is not what we want. So rather than create humans so that they behave like automatons, acting rightly out of necessity, that is, acting rightly because they have to, God created beings who have the power to act well or ill, free either to pursue the good and thereby and thereby enjoy God's eternal blessing, or to pursue the bad and thereby experience God's punishment. As things turned out, many humans used their free will to turn away from God, freely choosing to do ill rather than good, rejecting God's purpose for their lives. Thus, the evils in the world that are not bad acts of human free will or their causal effects, thus the evils in the world that are not bad acts of human free will or the causal effects of those actions are due to God's own acts of punishment for wrongful exercise of human free will. The cornerstone of this theodicy is that human free will is a good of such enormous value that God is justified in creating humans with free will, even if, as Augustine held, God knew in advance of creating them that certain human beings would use their freedom to do ill rather than good, while knowing that others would use their freedom to do mostly or only or mostly what is good. So all the horrendous evils occurring daily in our world are either evil acts of free human beings and their causal effects, or divine punishments for those actions. And the implication of this theodicy is that the good of human free will justifies God in permitting all these horrendous acts of evil and their causal effects, as well as the other evils resulting from plagues, floods, hurricanes, etc., that are God's way of punishing us for our evil acts. Okay, so like in section 2.1, the offset part of the text that's on page 9 is where Rowe lays out the theist's response, although then he's still explaining the theist's response on page 10, up to the top of page 11. Now, in this next paragraph, just this one paragraph, Rowe is going to respond to the theist's response, and he's going to do that by making 2 points, this one and this one. Okay, while this theodicy may explain some of the evil in our world, it cannot account for the massive amount of human suffering that is not due to human acts of free will. Natural disasters, floods, earthquakes, hurricanes, etc., bring about enormous amounts of human and animal suffering. But it is obvious that such suffering is not proportionate to the abuses of free will by humans. Okay, so we have floods, tsunamis, earthquakes, hurricanes that kill tens or hundreds or thousands of people. But some of those people that are killed, or maybe not killed, but just suffer quite a bit because of the natural disaster, are not people who have done any serious evils. Plus, some of them will be infants who haven't done anything evil at all. Animals will suffer, non-human animals will suffer and be killed. So these natural disasters bring about enormous amounts of human and animal suffering, but it is obvious that such suffering is not proportionate to the abuses of free will by humans. So we cannot reasonably think that such disasters are God's way of punishing human free choices to do evil. Okay, then second, while being free to do evil may be essential to genuine freedom, no responsible person thinks that the good of human freedom is so great as to require that no steps be taken to prevent some of the more flagrant abuses of free choice that result in massive, undeserved suffering by human and animals. Any moral person who had the power to do so would have intervened to prevent the evil free choices that resulted in the torture and death of 6 million Jews in the Holocaust. Okay, so maybe Hitler and the Nazis acted freely when they tortured and killed 6 million Jews, but no one would say that just because they were acting on their free will, that their actions shouldn't be prevented. No one would say, well, free will is such an important good that we shouldn't interfere with these people who are acting freely. We commonly act to restrict egregious abuses of human freedom that result in massive, undeserved human and animal suffering. Any moral being, including God, if he exists, would likely do the same. Okay, so those are Rowe's 2 responses to the free will theodicy, and this attempt to explain why there is so much evil in the world. And I didn't mention it earlier, but the free will theodicy is obviously based on this idea that we do have free will, but as we've already seen, that's a little bit problematic, so there's that issue as well. But okay, and since the free will theodicy is representative of the other attempts to justify God's permission of the horrendous evils in our world, it is reasonably clear that these evils cannot be explained away by appeal to theodicies. Okay, there are the other theodicies. Rowe is saying that he's looked at one central one, or one or one that is often invoked to explain why God allows so much evil. He's found these problems kind of straight away with this theodicy. So he's saying that, generally speaking, the other theodicies are also not going to be able to explain why we have so much evil in the world if God exists. But nonetheless, there are the other theodicies, and they're worth looking at. In this essay, I have argued that putting aside whatever reasons there may be to think that the theistic God exists, okay, so there are arguments for God's existence, cosmological argument, ontological argument, and different versions of those arguments. So Rowe hasn't looked into whether they provide reasons for thinking that God does exist. They're interesting arguments as well, although they seem to run into problems also. But rather than looking at these arguments that God does exist, Rowe has argued that the facts about evil in our world provide good reason to think that God does not exist. Okay.